Hi booktube, Aaron here, hope you're doing very well. Today I'm going to be talking about 3 books that I've finished since the beginning of August, and a lot of the other things I'm reading at the moment are quite bulky and I think will take me some time, so I'm going to take this time to go through these books. The first of these 3 books was an audiobook, which is a little bit unusual for me. I don't often listen to audiobooks. But on Spotify, they've got this thing where you get 15 hours of free audiobook time, and I decided to listen to one on a whim, and it was sort of just over that 15 hours that you get for free. So I had to wait until the beginning of August to listen to the last chapter or so of the book. The book in question was Politics on the Edge by Rory Stewart, which is a memoir of his time in politics. And on the whole, I did quite enjoy it. I did find it interesting because it's his whole time in politics. He's quite new to it at the beginning, and then there's his kind of rude awakening to how politics works and how Parliament works and what it's like to be a minister, and him trying to navigate various personalities, and as he's moving from post to post, he's having different kinds of relationships with different civil servants. It's sort of different in different departments. Some people may like him in one office, and then in another office they're expecting ministers to act in a completely different way. So it was interesting to get that look from an almost outside view, at least to begin with. But essentially, as a person, I do find him quite interesting. It looks like he joined up with the Conservative Party because he wanted to make a change, and he's quite an idealistic person. It seems, and so it always strikes me as quite strange that he sort of decided on the Conservative Party, but it might have just been a timing thing. I'm not sure, but it's fascinating to see that sort of idealism, and then it kind of just sort of bashes straight into the sort of reality and the absurdity of how British politics works and of the British establishment. And so it was interesting. I don't really know how much I have to say about it. I'm not sure how much he's sort of saving his own skin, or whether whether he is quite self-aware about how it may look for a politician to be talking about their career in politics. And it was intriguing to see his stance on Brexit, and to get a kind of insider's look into sort of what was going on in the run-up and in the aftermath to Brexit. And he certainly post-Brexit he seemed to be quite in the minority. So sort of once, so he'd been a Remainer, and then once the vote had come through that in general, that the vote was that people were to leave, that we were to leave the European Union, he wanted to honour that, and so despite what he would have wanted himself, he decided to go with the democratic process, and would have wanted to work out the best deal to serve people the best. And he sort of caught between these two camps of the kind of crazy people who eventually ended up in power, and people who essentially wanted either another referendum or just didn't want to heed to it, which to be honest, if I would have been quite comfortably in that camp at that time. And if there was a possible way to ignore Brexit or to go back on it so quickly, then I would would hope to go with it. But that's my own view. But it was fascinating to see his the little slice that he was existing in there, and sort of just how difficult it was to sort of negotiate any kind of conversation in that situation. So that was Politics on the Edge. I'll leave that there because I don't really know how much more of it would be interesting in a video like this, and I don't know to what extent I could really talk about that stuff and make it actually make sense. Next up, a book that was really, really delightful and one of my favourite books of the year so far, and it was Meetings with Remarkable Manuscripts by Christopher Hamel. This book is, so Christopher Hamel is an expert in manuscripts. There's a very official name for it that I won't be able to find now that begins with a P. I won't be able to remember it now, but he's an expert in manuscripts, has worked with Sotheby's in being able to validate manuscripts and sort of value them and things, and also works at has worked at a library in Cambridge, at Cambridge University, and so he's been working with these manuscripts his whole life. And then the idea of this book is essentially he's very, very aware of how few people get to see these and actually get to spend any time with the documents themselves. Even if you're an expert in a certain field and you want to see the manuscripts, a lot of collections, a lot of museums and libraries will see if they can palm you off with a facsimile edition or a digital edition, or that they kind of want to reserve the original for as few people as possible for issues of conservation and stuff. And so he's very aware that he's one of a very privileged few and wants to do what he can, not only to show you and describe these books to you, but also to describe what it's like to go into the places where they're kept and to take you along that journey, get a sense of the place, and then he then gives you a bit of the document's history. If there's any controversy about his history or things that are still undecided about it, then he'll go through that with you as well, and it will throw in his own opinion on that. And it's just all in all a really lovely and really wholesome book that gives you a lovely sweep through the history of manuscript making from I think he starts in the 7th century and it goes through to the 16th century, and so it's a really nice sweep of time, and you're seeing how initially you have these gospel books and things like that are really for monasteries and for churches and for cathedrals. Initially, a lot of them are maybe ceremonial books or show books for certain ceremonies, certain services, maybe to be left open at a certain page on a lectern, not necessarily to be used. Then you have things like books of hours and things used in monasteries, where they're like the books of hours were initially for novices, learning psalms, learning prayers for certain times of the day, learning what time of the year certain feast days were, and things like that. So novice monks and nuns would often have them, and then over time just normal lay people, I mean initially the aristocracy, kings and queens, wanted something of these monks and nuns' devotion, and so there started to be a bit of a market for books of hours outside of the monastery walls, and then there's a book trade sort of starting up that's completely it's completely separate from the monastic world, And there are bits where there are sort of little in-betweens, such as monasteries hiring scribes or itinerant monks who are scribes and things like that. But through the history of these specific books, you're also getting a history of how the history of the book changed in Europe at this time, and then getting to know a bit of some of the collectors and some of the institutions that are interested in these. And as you're moving from manuscript to manuscript in this book, sort of some of them become more familiar to you than others. And so yeah, it's really, really fascinating on that. Really beautiful. As you're going through each chapter, the first thing that you'll see is a picture of just the cover of the book, just to give you an idea of what it's like as an object. And then once he's done that, he'll probably talk about arriving at the library and his expectations. This is the university library at Leiden. This was quite a funny chapter where he gets caught in the rain on the way in, and he describes himself as looking like a bedraggled axe murderer or something like that, and having to find somewhere to put his soggy hat. Yeah, he's got a sense of humour that sort of grows on you as the book goes on. And then of course you get pictures of the inside of the book. As you're going through the chapters in this edition, they're all in black and white, but then you get some colour plates in the middle, at least one plate for every manuscript mentioned. And he does go to see the Book of Kells in Dublin. That's one of the ones that he goes to visit. He goes to visit 12, and it is quite funny with the Book of Kells, where so he absolutely loves the actual calligraphy, the actual writing in the Book of Kells, which he thinks is second to none. He's not a massive fan of the artwork itself, particularly. Does he have that one in colour? He might leave it out actually, because yeah, he does. He leaves it out in the colour bit. Hopefully you can make out the black and white one okay. But that's a picture of the Virgin and Child in the Book of Kells. And there's this paragraph where he says he's probably never going to be let into Ireland again because he thinks it's just the most ugly painting he's ever seen. And I mean, it's not particularly flattering, to be honest. I can kind of see where he's coming from, but he absolutely loves the writing in the Book of Kells, and that's what he really, really loves. And every now and then you just do turn the page on something like this, or to some really intricate decoration, and it just does blow your breath away. And actually, since we're on the Book of Kells, because he goes into a bit of the history of where it was written, and he reckons it was, I think the consensus was that it was written on the island of Iona, which is a Scottish island, but at the time the monastery there was run by Irish monks. However, there's that bit of a tension there where it's such a famous Irish, what's the word I'm thinking of? It's like a national treasure to Ireland, the Book of Kells, and so it's a bit of a, it would be a bit of a sore point if it was written somewhere else. But this is kind of his take on it. Whether the Book of Kells was made partly or all on Iona, or whether it was made or completed at Kells in Ireland, hinges entirely on the date assigned to it. Paleographers, that's the name beginning with a P that I was trying to find. That's someone who specialises in manuscripts. paleographers have argued for different dates between the late 7th and mid-9th century because of Viking raids. So whether they ended up on, whether they were in Iona or Kells depends on, when the Vikings were attacking Iona. On balance, the current consensus puts it around the very end of the 8th century. The unmatched sophistication of the enterprise and the coordination of its craftsmen seems to point to production in a large and organised community, not in a party of migrant refugees. We even know the name of a master scribe on Iona, Abbot Connachtach, I'm not sure if I'm saying that right, who died in 1802. Whether he was the designer, we will never know, but he might have been. An origin on Iona does not undermine the absolute Irishness of the manuscript, for it was an exclusively Irish community on an island accessed from Ireland, not yet classified by modern political borders. It is, however, historically likely that the Book of Kells, the most Irish of all works of art, was actually made in what is now Scotland. Let's start that sentence again. So, an origin on Iona does not undermine the absolute Irishness of the manuscript, for it was an exclusively Irish community on an island accessed from Ireland, not yet classified by modern political borders. It is, however, historically likely that the Book of Kells, the most Irish of all works of art, was actually made in what is now Scotland, and, after all, Finnegan's Wake was written in Paris, and its right Irishness is not in doubt either. I just like that little nod to Joyce, and there are plenty of works of art by artists from all over the world, and where they may not have been created in their country of origin, and yet are still celebrated. So I did like the way he managed to sort of bring it all back in that way, even if I butchered the sentence itself. So this is Meetings with Remarkable Manuscripts. I really loved it. It was really quite emotional at the end. There's a postscript where he talks about how he got into manuscripts and what it means for him. And then he ends it all by saying, if I can flick past to the end, he ends it on a very, very touching note. So he says, if someday one high school student reads this or visits the Parker Library, which is the library where he first encountered a manuscript in Dunedin in New Zealand. If someday a high school student reads this or visits the Parker Library and is inspired to enjoy manuscripts, it will all have been worthwhile. And it's just sort of lovely that it's the subject itself, it's the manuscripts themselves he loves, not him being there with them. And so there's just this sense of him wanting to pass it on, which is really lovely and really generous, and I found really, really touching at the end of the book. So again, I'd recommend it if any of my butchered readings from that made it stand out to you at all. And then finally, hopefully very quickly, we'll go through the third book I finished, which was Gaudete by Ted Hughes. A really strange book, a sort of long narrative book, mostly told in poetry, and a very, very strange subject matter. So the sort of setup of the book is that the Reverend Nicholas Lumb, a vicar in a small town in the north of England, has been abducted by mysterious agents of the underworld. While he's there are these strange rites that sort of go on. And actually, the moment he finds himself in the underworld is really striking. He just turns a corner in the town, and suddenly there are piles of bodies everywhere, and it sort of goes on from there in this really quite surreal sequence. But this sort of ritual goes on where somehow a double of himself is created, and the double goes out into the real world instead of him to take his place. And the main action of the whole book is the last day of this double before he's, as Hughes puts it in a sort of argument at the beginning of the book, before he's cancelled by the powers of the other world and the powers of this world. And what's going on during that day is incredibly gratuitous on the part of Hughes, incredibly strange, but then it all works to a wonderful climax. It's almost like Greek tragedy, and so, but kind of without the tragedy. It all ends very mysteriously, but that build-up of violence and dread reminded me a lot of like Aeschylus. And essentially what's going on is that this reverend, or this double of the reverend, has interpreted Christianity in his own way and has decided that he is to father a new Messiah, and somehow he knows that someone in the village or the town is to be the mother, but he doesn't know exactly who. And so through this sort of strange hypnosis, this strange power that he seems to have over everyone in the village, he proceeds to sleep with every woman in the village repeatedly. And so this last day that he's there, he has liaisons with many of the women in the village. They also hold these secret meetings in the church basement where they have these rituals, and presumably they also have they get up to all kinds of business, is what's suggested. But we only ever see the last of these rituals where things go quite wrong, and as you might expect as well, some of the other people in the village, some of the husbands, partners and family of these women are kind of noticing that something's going on. And so then you have this kind of Frankenstein situation where everyone is sort of herding in to take their revenge on the monster, and you have this sort of hunt sequence towards the end of the book, and that's the sort of main action of what goes on for the most part in the book, all told in these sort of short poetic sections in very descriptive or sometimes very suggestive language, but all very quite it's quite intense, as you often get with Hughes, and just incredibly insistent. It's like watching something on TV with the sound turned off. No one says anything, but you're very much getting people's feelings and their facial expressions. And then there's lots of, although there is lots of sex going on, it's very rarely actually described, and yet there's always this feeling of sort of discomfort. There's a bit where something is going on in a shed, and as it's happening, they're knocking over all of these all these little cages that have rodents in them that are kept in the shed, and there are rodents crawling everywhere. And so there's this mix of something quite erotic going on, and something sort of disgusting, and something I don't know, there is a sense of shame or disgust spread over everything, and a kind of strangeness to it. And again, there's just the way he's writing is so descriptive and so on the outside of everything. It's a really odd reading experience. And then you get to the end of the book, you get to an epigraph, an epilogue, and we suddenly have a whole sort of prose section in the west coast of Ireland. It sort of totally moves the setting to this this priest there, presumably the original Lumb who's escaped from the underworld, and he's presented with this notebook by these girls, and they're saying this man who gave it to them had performed miracles. And then he opens the notebook, and it's just full of these short, fragmentary poems. And suddenly, with a book that's been so descriptive and so on the outside, suddenly with these poems, you're on the inside, and it's still very strange and very odd, and nothing's quite settled in what's being said. However, it's incredibly jarring and quite moving to suddenly have a change in perspective in that way. And it kind of seems like these poems originally were Hughes speaking, Hughes teasing things out and exploring himself. It's written in 1977, so a good deal of time after Sylvia Plath's death, after Assia Wevel's death, and I mean, yeah, it certainly seems, from the way that women are treated throughout this book, that his, treatment of women and his attitudes towards women had hardly changed by this point. Yeah, but there is this reflective voice, and he seems to be reflecting on elements of the fallout particularly after Sylvia Plath died, and it seems to be a warm-up towards the kind of voice that he would utilise in Birthday Letters, his last collection. And it starts off, with this. What will you make of half a man, half a face, a ripped edge? His one-eyed waking is the shorn sleep of aftermath. His vigour, the bone deformity of consequences. His talents, the deprivations of escape. How will you correct the veteran of negatives and the survivor of cease? So yeah, it to be fair, it actually seems slightly more self-reflective than he actually ever is in Birthday Letters. In Birthday Letters, he's trying to give his side of the record, and yet there he does seem to be actually examining himself a little more, which I find interesting, because it's something he never really does anywhere else in his poetry, and only here in this book there's a kind of smokescreen of the larger narrative of the book, and that this isn't really supposed to be him. However, there's then this bit, waving goodbye from your banked hospital bed, waving, weeping, smiling, flushed. It happened. You knocked the world off like a flower vase. It was the third time, and it smashed. I turned, I bowed. In the morgue I kissed your temples, refrigerated, glazed, as rained on graveyard marble. My lips queasy, heart non-existent, and straightened into sun darkness, like a pillar over Athens defunct in the glaring metropolis of cameras. And that seems to be the first instant, I think, in his published poetry where he engages with any of Sylvia Plath's poems, I could sort of tease out Tulips and Lady Lazarus from a couple of the lines in there. And it was the third time and knocked the world off like a flower vase. And then there's the aftermath with in the glaring metropolis of cameras as well. So this very private image of kissing her head in the morgue to going out into the world where it's not private anymore. And yeah, I do sort of find it fascinating, this contrast between the different styles he's utilising throughout the book. As an overall experience, I did really enjoy it. I find it hard to recommend something like this. I think it's really only for someone who's read other things by Ted Hughes and has enjoyed them. The name Gaudete, which I'll finish off with, a little enigmatic. There's only one reference to Gaudete throughout the whole book, and it's as someone's walking through a graveyard and there's a solitary gravestone, presumably forgotten and untended, with Gaudete's name. And I couldn't tease out, maybe on a reread I'll double check, but I couldn't tease out any connection or any specific reaction from any of the characters to this gravestone. But it's only mentioned once, and I thought it was telling that the title of the book is a name on a gravestone. So I'll leave it there. That's what I've been reading recently. I'm currently a good way of the way into Middlemarch by George Eliot, which I'm loving. I'm about a third of the way through this. And then for another Eliot, I'm sort of joining in with the T.S. Eliot reading project. So I've got my complete poems and plays. I'm planning to try and read through a good deal of the poems this month. There are set poems that everyone's looking at, and I'm going to try and fill in some of the gaps. I've been reading through some of the quatrain poems that he was writing between sort of Proof Rock and The Wasteland, because they're not quite as familiar to me. I've never really enjoyed them as much, so I'll try and I'll try and do a video about the early period of T.S. Eliot's poetry. And as a side note, I think when I showed this before, I had the dust cover on, that it had this kind of design, which I've never particularly liked, from Faber and Faber from sort of the 90s, I think. But I took it off and sort of saw what it looked like underneath and just found it to be much nicer. And it just seemed like a nicer book as soon as I took it off, so I think I'm leaving it off. And I'm also reading the cantos by Ezra Pound, going at a slow pace, but I'm enjoying it. And that's that. So I'll leave it there. Hopefully it's not run on too long. But let me know if you've read any of these or if you're interested in any of these. But for now, thanks for watching, and I'll see you soon. Bye-bye.